They say these mountains never forget. The wind that crawls through the hollers carries stories, not the ones you'll find in books, but the ones whispered at kitchen tables when the lamps burn low. In the late 1960s, deep in the folds of Appalachia, there was a name no one wanted to speak. A man who vanished from history, erased by time and shame. The papers called him a drifter. Locals called him the butcher. But those who lived to remember him called him something else. The cannibal that God forgot. Life back then was simple, or at least that's what outsiders said. Coal mines still coughed up dust. Men came home with lungs darker than the hills themselves. Women mended clothes until their fingers bled. And kids learned early that the world didn't owe them mercy. But even in the quietest towns, evil finds a way to survive, hiding in plain sight, wearing the same tired face as every other man on the street. His name was Elias Boone. Born poor, raised poorer. He lived on the edge of town, a cluster of shacks patched with tin and prayer. His father was a miner. His mother died before he could spell her name. Some said starvation killed her. Others said she walked into the woods and never came back. Either way, that's where Elias learned the silence of the mountains and how to live without love. When you looked at him, you saw nothing remarkable. A narrow face, eyes too light, hands that never seemed to rest. He was the kind of man who blended into photographs until you realized he wasn't supposed to be there. He hunted alone, trapped rabbits, sold pelts, and when meat was scarce, he found other ways to feed. People started noticing strange things that winter. Dogs gone missing, smoke rising from the Boone cabin long after midnight. A sour smell that lingered even when the snow came down heavy. But no one asked questions, not here. In Appalachia, privacy was sacred, even when it reeked of sin. The first real clue came with the thaw. A boy named Michael Greer went missing after school, though they found his lunch pail 3 miles down the creek, rusted, half buried in mud. His parents searched for weeks. The sheriff called it a runaway, but in towns like these, kids didn't run away. They froze, they starved, they disappeared. By the time the next child vanished, a girl named Ruthie Collins, fear had started to spread like wildfire through the valley. Folks stopped letting their children walk alone. Church bells rang for longer on Sundays, and whispers turned into stories that kept neighbors awake at night. Elias didn't come to church that month. He told the preacher he'd been sick, but someone saw him at the general store buying salt. 10 pounds of it. Another said he'd been digging a pit behind his house. When the sheriff rode out there, he found nothing but ash, bones, and a silence so thick it made the horses uneasy. They brought Elias in for questioning once. He said little, only that the hills provide for those who listen. No one knew what that meant, but when the sheriff looked in his eyes, he saw something hollow. A man who wasn't afraid of hell because he'd already lived there. No charges were filed, no proof, just suspicion and that smell, the same sour rot that clung to his coat. By summer, 3 more people had gone missing. Travelers, drifters, men no one would miss. The sheriff stopped counting after the 4th. He called it nature's doing. The mountains, he said, swallow their own. But deep down, everyone knew. The mountain wasn't hungry. Elias was. Neighbors claimed they saw him talking to himself in the fields. Others said he was seen carrying a sack that dripped red. He told them it was animal meat. But when one hunter followed his tracks, they led not to the woods, but to a cave, hidden behind a curtain of vines, a place locals called Devil's Mouth. Inside, They found candles, bones, and jars filled with something unholy. Pale flesh floating in brine, and on the wall, carved with a rusted knife, were the words, "The body is the altar." No one reported it. Not yet. Because fear in Appalachia isn't loud. It's quiet. It sits at your table, drinks your coffee, and reminds you that some truths are better left buried. Elias stopped appearing in town that fall. The coal company shut down. The preacher moved away. The valley sank into ruin. But every few years, when the leaves turned red and the air smelled of smoke, someone swore they saw him, standing at the edge of the woods, watching. And each time that happened, another person vanished. Half a century later, I came across the case file, or rather, what was left of it. Torn pages, missing photographs, and a single note written in the sheriff's hand. Do not speak his name. Do not open the cave. The report ended there, but the evidence, what little survived, painted a picture far worse than the stories. Fragments of bone recovered from the cave were human. The jars contained what forensic testing later confirmed as preserved tissue. Hearts, tongues, pieces of skin, and one final discovery, a photograph, burnt at the edges, showing Elias standing beside something, or someone. The figure next to him was barely human, a shape blurred by movement, but the outline was clear. A second body, his own reflection, perhaps, or the thing he believed he was becoming. They said Elias called himself the Angel of Hunger. To him, flesh wasn't food, it was salvation, a ritual to bind himself to something older than God. Locals believed he worshipped an ancient spirit buried beneath the hills. He said it whispered through the wind, promising him eternal life if he fed it what it craved most. And he obeyed, not because he was insane, but because he was faithful. When I visited the old Boone property, the cabin was gone, burned to its foundation decades ago, but the ground was still scarred. Patches of soil that refused to grow grass, stones marked with symbols no one could translate. And in the cave, the smell still lingered. After all these years, it hadn't faded. That's when I understood. The reason the town buried his name wasn't to forget him. It was to contain him. What happens to a story when no one's left to tell it? It rots, like meat left in the dark. But sometimes, rot is what keeps memory alive. The last page of the file carried one more note, a confession of sorts, written by Sheriff Don Whitmore before his death in 1972. I should have stopped him sooner, but part of me wanted to understand. He said hunger isn't what kills us, it's what makes us human. And beneath that, in smaller writing, one final line. I hear him still when the wind moves through the holler. The case was never reopened. The files were locked away, and the story of Elias Boone, the forgotten cannibal, became just another ghost story told to children who wandered too far into the woods. But truth has a way of clawing back to the surface, even when it's been buried under 50 years of silence. And what I found next was proof that Elias Boone didn't act alone, because monsters rarely do. The first real blood was spilled on a Thursday. At least, that's what the reports suggest. But out here, time moves differently. Days stretch into one another. The air itself remembers. When I started tracing the timeline, I realized something. Elias Boone didn't just snap one day. His hunger wasn't born in a moment. It evolved slowly, like rot spreading under the floorboards. It began with an old man named Harlan Sutter, retired miner, lived alone in a shack 2 miles from the Boone property. The sheriff's report said he went missing during a storm, but photographs taken a week later told another story. A boot print in the mud, Small, narrow, almost delicate. Not Harlan's, not a man's at all. And next to it, the imprint of a hand, not pressed flat, but clawed into the soil as if someone had crawled away from something. Locals said Harlan's dog howled for 3 nights straight before going silent. When they found the animal's remains, the bones were stripped clean. No blood, no tracks, just a trail of ash leading toward the woods. Elias was seen that same night carrying a lantern through the rain. A neighbor, Lorna Pike, remembered it clearly. He walked like the storm belonged to him, and the light, it didn't flicker. When asked what she meant, she couldn't explain. But the look in her eyes when she spoke his name told me everything. What happened next still doesn't make sense. Not scientifically, not spiritually. Because the second disappearance followed a pattern that no human hunger could justify. A family, the Turners, gone in one night. A father, a mother, 2 children. Their house was found open. Dinner still warm on the table. Chairs overturned. One window shattered inward, not out. The sheriff's notes mentioned a foul odor, like burnt meat, and markings on the walls. Lines scratched in circles, layered over and over until the wood split. And there, carved above the mantel, the same phrase found later in the cave. The body is the altar. No blood was recovered, not one drop. But the ashes in the fireplace contained fragments of teeth, small ones, from a child. The local church called it satanic hysteria. The sheriff called it accident, but no one believed that. Not when the fields went quiet, not when crows stopped landing near the Boone property. Something had shifted, like the land itself had turned its back. For weeks the town lived in fear of the dark. Doors stayed bolted, fires never went out, and Elias Boone seemed to vanish until he didn't. One evening, 2 brothers, Hank and Roy Dillard, decided to go looking for him. They were hunters, strong men, drunk on fear and courage. They said they wanted to end it once and for all. They never came home. The search party found their rifles leaning against a tree, their lanterns still burning, and beside them, 2 sets of skin, peeled clean, hanging like clothes on a branch. No bodies, no blood, just the smell. That same sweet, sour rot that haunted every place Elias touched. The sheriff wrote it off as wild animal mutilation, but no animal hangs skin with precision. No beast leaves a clean edge. That's when he finally ordered the cave sealed. But it was too late. A hunter named Samuel Crow, one of the few who didn't believe in curses, broke into the cave weeks later. He found what the sheriff wouldn't admit: the jars, the bones, the drawings. But most disturbing of all, the altar, made from timber and flesh, bound with wire and sinew, and upon it a shape resembling a human, incomplete, stitched from parts that didn't belong together. At its center, a heart, blackened but still wet. Samuel ran. He made it halfway down the trail before collapsing, his mouth full of blood. When they found him, his tongue was missing, cut out, surgically. For months after, silence ruled the valley. The sheriff quit. The preacher left. People packed up what they could and moved out, leaving behind a town that no map would claim. And the Boone cabin stood alone, windows shattered, door hanging open, waiting. When investigators returned decades later, they found something the original reports omitted. Underneath the floorboards, a hollow space filled with bones, human bones, dozens of them, and each skull had a small round hole carved into the forehead. Deliberate, measured, not random violence, ritual. What makes this story truly horrifying isn't the brutality, it's the intent. Elias Boone wasn't killing to eat, he was rebuilding, piece by piece, person by person. shaping what he called the vessel, a human form that could contain the spirit he worshipped, the god of hunger, he called it, the one that spoke to him through the wind. One diary entry survived, half burned, but legible enough to make sense of his madness. It read, "The meat gives life, the soul gives meaning. Together, they make the angel." In another line, almost tender in its phrasing, "I feed them to keep them close. Their voices stay inside me. I am never alone." Those words didn't come from insanity. They came from devotion. That's what makes Elias different from the killers that came after him. He didn't see himself as evil. He saw himself as chosen. The strangest part, the killings stopped. Not because he was caught, but because the mountain took him. One night, after a storm, the cave collapsed. No body was ever recovered. But deep in the rubble, among shards of glass and bone, investigators found something. A single human jaw, still attached to muscle tissue, and a locket inside its mouth. Inside the locket, a photograph of Elias as a child, smiling, holding hands with a woman whose face had been scratched away. For decades, people assumed that was the end. But the story didn't end there, because in 1973, 5 years after the last known victim, a hiker stumbled upon something strange on the ridge above Devil's Mouth. A small clearing, rocks arranged in a perfect circle, and at its center, a single wooden cross, freshly carved with the same phrase etched across it, "The body is the altar." The soil around it was warm, as if something had just been buried there. They dug 6 feet down and found nothing. But on the 7th foot, the shovel struck bone, clean, polished, and human. The sheriff at the time refused to speak on record, but in a private note, he wrote, "It wasn't Boone, not this time. The hands were too small." Some say it was a copycat. Others believe the ritual had been passed on, inherited by someone else, someone who'd watched and learned. Because evil, once born, doesn't just die. It migrates. It hides in the soil. It waits for the next man, desperate enough to listen. Every community has its ghost stories. But this one isn't told around campfires. It's buried in archives, sealed by silence, guarded by those who still believe Elias Boone was more than a man. He was a warning, a reminder that when hunger and faith collide, nothing human survives. And the most disturbing truth, he may not have been the first, because when forensic teams cross-checked missing persons data from surrounding counties, they found patterns going back 20 years before Boone's birth. Same marks, same disappearances, same message carved into bone. The body is the altar. It wasn't just him. It was a tradition, one passed down through generations, until someone finally decided to finish it. Understanding Elias Boone means descending into a place most people never return from. Not the cave where he worked, but the mind that built it. Every monster begins as a man. Every ritual starts as a reason. And sometimes, reason looks a lot like faith. The psychological records that survived, if you can call them that, paint a portrait of neglect, silence, and obsession. Born in 1941, in a mining town that barely existed on a map, Elias grew up surrounded by absence. No mother, no guidance, no hope. His father drank, beat, and prayed in the same breath. One witness described the Boone cabin as a church with no God, crosses on the wall, dead eyes at the table, and a boy who learned early that love was conditional, and pain was proof of life. Neighbors said Elias would sit for hours behind the church, carving shapes into bark, sometimes faces, sometimes symbols, and sometimes words no one could read. The preacher once caught him digging up a small grave behind the property. Said Elias told him he wanted to see if the soul was still there. He was 9. That's where it starts. Curiosity curdling into control. He wanted to understand death, not as an ending, but as a material, a thing he could touch, rearrange, and eventually command. When you look through the lens of forensic psychology, Elias fits what we now call a ritualistic, narcissistic sadist. He wasn't driven by impulse. He was driven by design. Each act of violence served a structure, a step in his theology of hunger. He didn't believe he was killing people. He believed he was liberating them from flesh, while feeding something divine that lived within him. In his later writings, those found etched on bone fragments, he refers to the feast of light. He believed consuming the body would release the soul, that in doing so, the eater became the vessel, the new temple of that spirit. In his mind, he wasn't desecrating life. He was recycling it, turning death into communion. That's why he salted the flesh. That's why he preserved organs in jars. It wasn't storage. It was preservation of holiness. Each jar was a reliquary, each body part a prayer. And he, the priest. People often ask, how does a man like that become so detached from empathy? The truth is, he never had any to lose. Empathy requires reflection, seeing yourself in another person. But Elias didn't see people as mirrors. He saw them as ingredients. When I read through the interviews conducted after his disappearance, something caught my attention. A school teacher from his childhood described him as unnervingly polite. He helped her carry books. He smiled when others didn't. But once she found a bird, dead, placed neatly on her desk, its eyes removed, its wings arranged into a cross. Elias was 12. Later, when he was 17, his father died in a cave-in at the mine. They say Elias was the first to arrive at the site, before the rescue crew. He stayed underground for hours alone with the body. When they found him, his hands were covered in coal dust and blood. He claimed he'd been praying, but one of the miners swore he saw Elias biting into something before they pulled him out. That part never made the report. After that, he left town, drifted between jobs: butcher, trapper, grave digger, each one putting him closer to what he'd eventually become. Every profession, a rehearsal. His handwriting changed around 1965, jagged, uneven, like someone carving instead of writing. He started adding symbols, circles within circles, intersecting triangles, crude eyes. Psychiatrists who later examined these markings noticed a pattern. All geometric, all symmetrical, all connected by the number 7. 7 offerings, 7 souls, 7 doors to the light beyond hunger. That's when he began building the vessel, a construct of belief, half theology, half anatomy. In his view, humanity had forgotten the purpose of death. He saw it as restoration. To him, every scream, every cut, every bite was a sacrament, a way to keep the balance between the living and the forgotten. I remember sitting in the archive room, reading his notes by flashlight. One line stopped me cold. God made man in his image. I only return the favor. It's not the language of madness. It's the language of imitation. He wasn't rebelling against creation. He was trying to perfect it. You can trace that mindset back to a concept we see in extreme narcissism: omnipotent identification. The subject begins to believe they share essence with divinity, not metaphorically, but literally. Every act becomes holy, every atrocity justified. That's why punishment means nothing to men like Elias Boone. How do you punish someone who thinks he's fulfilling prophecy? It's easy to label him a monster, but monsters don't write prayers. He did. One of his carvings, later recovered from Devil's Mouth Cave, depicts a man kneeling, his chest open, ribs fanned out like wings. Below it, a single phrase: he flies on hunger. To Elias, pain wasn't corruption. It was transformation, the shedding of weakness, the metamorphosis into something eternal. What makes this case so unnerving is not the violence. It's the calm. No rage, no frenzy. He worked like a craftsman, deliberate, patient, methodical. The killings weren't random. They followed alignment, lunar phases, seasonal cycles, even weather patterns. Each sacrifice performed under specific conditions of light and silence. That precision reveals control, not chaos. When modern profilers examined the case, many compared him to religious cult leaders: Jim Jones, David Berg, even early manifestations of ritual sects in rural America. But there's a difference. Those men wanted followers. Elias wanted witnesses, people who would see what he saw, then join him. He believed he could convert others through fear, through hunger, through communion. Evidence supports that theory. Fingerprints from the Boone cabin included more than one person. At least 2 sets couldn't be matched to any known local resident, meaning he wasn't alone. He had help, or perhaps disciples. What fascinates me is his obsession with language, especially how he redefined everyday words. In his notes, food meant soul, fire meant purification, light meant memory. To him, consuming another being was not destruction, but union. He wasn't taking life, he was merging with it. That's how cannibalism becomes theology, when the act of eating turns into worship, and flesh becomes scripture. Somewhere in his writings, he mentions a dream, recurring, relentless. A woman standing in the river, holding out her hand. She whispers, "Eat, and you'll see me again." Investigators believed it referred to his mother, the one who vanished into the woods when he was a child. Maybe she died, maybe she didn't, but in his mind, she became divine. The voice that guided him, the hunger that raised him. He turned abandonment into religion. It's the perfect psychological storm. Isolation, deprivation, faith twisted into compulsion. He created meaning where there was none. He gave purpose to pain. And once a man believes pain has purpose, he stops feeling it altogether. That's why his victims rarely fought back. They trusted him. He spoke softly, quoted scripture, promised healing. To the desperate, he seemed holy. And by the time they realized the truth, it was too late. The forensic files show restraint marks, careful, symmetrical, designed to preserve the body's integrity. He didn't mutilate in rage. He dissected in reverence. And that distinction between sadism and sanctification is what sets him apart. He wasn't killing to dominate, he was killing to commune. I've studied a lot of cases, but none linger like this one, because somewhere beneath the horror lies something disturbingly human. The need to matter, the craving to be seen, even by darkness. Elias wanted love. He just mistook hunger for it. When he wrote, "The hills will remember me," he was right. They do. And now, so do we. The deeper you go into this case, the more it stops feeling like history and starts feeling like contagion. Every file I opened led to another door, and behind each door, a name crossed out, a page missing, a silence carefully constructed by those who lived long enough to fear remembering. The first official investigation began in 1969, a full year after the last confirmed disappearance. By then, most of the town was gone. What remained were the stubborn, the old, the faithful, and the ones who believed monsters die when you stop speaking their names. But silence doesn't kill truth. It only buries it deeper. Sheriff Don Whitmore, the same man who'd once interrogated Elias Boone, was pressured by the state to reopen the file. Federal agents arrived. Young, clean, convinced logic could explain everything. They brought equipment, forensic cameras, plaster molds for footprints. What they didn't bring was understanding. Appalachia doesn't give up its secrets easily. It waits, it watches, and it makes you earn every answer with fear. The first site they examined was the Boone cabin, or what was left of it. The roof had collapsed. Trees had begun to reclaim the yard. Inside they found layers of ash and a faint outline burned into the wooden floor, the shape of a man's body in cruciform position. The boards beneath that outline were darker, as if soaked in oil or something thicker. Tests later confirmed it wasn't animal fat. It was human tissue, liquefied by heat and time. Near the hearth, they discovered a set of objects arranged like an altar, 7 rusted knives, a tin cup filled with salt, and a Bible missing every page from the book of Genesis. The margins were scribbled with notes, written in 2 distinct handwritings. One was Boone's, the other unidentified. That was the first real sign that he hadn't worked alone. Outside, agents unearthed fragments of glass jars buried in the garden. Traces of human collagen were still detectable inside them, mixed with soil and ash. And on one shard, scratched into the glass, 3 words: "Feed the light." For weeks they sent samples to the state lab in Charleston, but half the evidence vanished en route, misfiled, lost, forgotten. The pattern had begun. The next step was Devil's Mouth Cave. The site locals refused to enter. The air there is wrong. Heavy, damp, metallic. When you breathe it in, it feels like inhaling memory itself. The kind that clings to your lungs and doesn't let go. The team found bones first, arranged deliberately in a circle, as if marking a boundary. Then deeper in the tunnel, they uncovered wooden structures coated in wax. Preservation, not decoration. The bones within were human, femurs, ribs, vertebrae, all marked with shallow grooves, as though someone had been carving symbols into them. And in the center of the chamber, a single stone slab, flat, smooth, and stained a color no one could identify. Something between rust and shadow. Forensic tests later found trace amounts of calcium, copper, and hemoglobin, the chemical remains of life. Someone had used that slab, not as a table, but as a stage, to perform something ancient, something rehearsed. One agent, a man named Cooper, described hearing whispers in the cave when the team first entered. He said it sounded like breath, moving between walls, like someone exhaling words that never formed. The others laughed it off, until the tape recorder caught it too. A low hum, rhythmic, pulsing, almost human. Audio engineers later confirmed, no insects, no wind, no mechanical cause, just resonance, like the mountain itself was remembering the ritual. They sealed the cave within days. But that decision came too late, because what they found next shouldn't have existed. In the final log entry from that investigation, a note reads, "Recovered preserved organ matter in secondary chamber, heart, partial brain, fragments of jaw, tissue fresh, less than 1 week old." That was dated January 17th, 1969, meaning something or someone was still performing the rituals long after Elias Boone disappeared. The agents burned what they could. They destroyed evidence, something unthinkable by today's standards, but they believed it was necessary. In the official statement, they wrote, "Residual contamination risk, containment advised." Unspoken translation, whatever Boone started didn't end with him. In 1971, an anthropologist named Dr. Carol Winters came to document the site. She was one of the few outsiders allowed near the cave after it was sealed. Her notes, unpublished until her death, described the cave as an anti-church. She wrote, "The Boone ritual mimics the Eucharist inverted. Flesh instead of bread, blood instead of wine, silence instead of salvation." She concluded her journal with one final observation. The participants weren't worshiping a god, they were becoming it. The government called it superstition. Locals called it a curse. But the truth lies somewhere between faith and infection, between belief and contagion. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became. This was not a lone killer. It was a lineage, a pattern repeating through generations, hidden by isolation, justified by hunger, protected by faith. There were whispers of others, families who vanished between 1947 and 1955 in nearby hollers. No formal investigation, no records. But when I cross-checked missing persons files from those years, I found the same strange detail in 3 separate reports. Victims last seen near mining shafts, all within 7 miles of the Boone property, all gone without trace, all connected by one phrase written in chalk at each site: "The light remembers." To law enforcement, it was coincidence. To me, it was continuity, a thread that connected Boone's actions to something older, something systemic, the way the bones were arranged, the numbers, the geometry. This wasn't improvisation, it was doctrine. By 1974, all files related to Boone and Devil's Mouth were classified under localized religious disturbance, a convenient label for something that defied definition. The records were sealed in a state archive, labeled hazardous, and the witnesses, those few still alive, refused to talk. 2 died within months of being interviewed, one by drowning, one by fire, both ruled accidents. You learn to stop believing in coincidences after a case like this. In 1982, a deputy named Charles Baird reopened the investigation privately. He'd grown up near Boone Hollow, said he used to play in the woods around the cave as a child. When he came back as an adult, he found markers carved into trees, the same symbols Elias Boone had etched decades earlier. He followed them for half a mile. They led him to a clearing, and at the center of that clearing, a crude wooden structure shaped like a man. Inside its chest cavity, a jar, sealed tight, containing what looked like a human tongue. The label on the jar read, Sermon number 8. Deputy Baird quit the next day. He mailed the jar to a private investigator in Knoxville. It never arrived. When I began tracing that evidence myself, 50 years later, I realized what everyone else had missed. The Boone case wasn't about murder. It was about inheritance, a belief passed down through fear. The idea that consuming another human was the only way to keep their soul alive. A cult of hunger disguised as salvation. Even now, locals speak of lights flickering in the woods, soft singing drifting through fog, a smell that rises from the soil after rain, copper, salt, decay. They say it's the mountain exhaling. I think it's something older. The echo of ritual carved into the land itself. The files end abruptly in 1985. No closure, no culprit. Just one final statement, typed and unsigned. Containment complete. The land will remember. That line haunts me, because containment implies danger, and memory implies persistence. I've walked those woods myself. At dusk, when the mist settles and the trees lean close, it feels alive, like the hills themselves are breathing. And somewhere in that breath, if you listen long enough, you can still hear it. A low hum, a whisper between branches, the same rhythm recorded in that cave half a century ago. Proof, perhaps, that Boone's ritual never ended, that the mountain and everything buried beneath it is still feeding. Judgment is supposed to bring peace. But when a man like Elias Boone stands trial, even in absence, there's no peace to be found. Only paperwork, bones, and echoes of a truth that no one wants to read aloud. The first trial never happened. You can't prosecute a ghost. When the state declared Boone legally dead in 1972, they closed the case with a single line: remains unlocated, presumed deceased. But the community, what little remained of it, needed a villain. They needed to point to something and say, that's where evil lives. So they built a courtroom around a photograph, and they tried a shadow. The hearings lasted 4 days. No defense, no witness willing to speak without trembling. The prosecutor read from the sheriff's reports, the autopsy fragments, the burned Bible pages. Each piece of evidence felt less like proof and more like confession written by the land itself. On the final day, the judge said something that stayed with me. He looked at Boone's empty chair and whispered, "If he's dead, may the earth refuse him. If he's alive, may God forget him." Then he struck the gavel. Once. That was the verdict. Not guilty, not innocent, just gone. No one clapped, no one cried. Because in that room, surrounded by the smell of wet wood and cigarette smoke, everyone knew the same truth. Judgment doesn't work on what refuses to die. After the ruling, the files were archived, sealed under historical religious case 134B. It should have ended there. But judgment has a way of echoing, and echoes, like hunger, don't stop when you close the door. In '97, 15 years after Boone's death certificate was signed, a set of remains surfaced in the foothills near the Tennessee border. A hiker stumbled across them, a partial skeleton arranged neatly in a circle of stones. The bones had been cleaned, bleached by the sun, and around the ribcage was a belt of leather, carved with 7 symbols. When investigators examined it under magnification, they saw initials burned into the underside. E.B. Boone's signature, the same scrawl that appeared in his journals. But the bone marrow told another story. The remains belonged to a woman, and she'd been dead less than a year. The cycle had restarted. DNA testing was in its infancy, but the blood found on a nearby branch matched type O negative, the same as Boone's. No one could explain it. The sheriff at the time, Thomas Kearns, wrote in his field report, "It's like the devil's playing reruns. They buried the remains quietly, without ceremony." The file, 1134B supplement, was locked away again. And for the next 2 decades, nothing moved, not until I opened it. You can feel Boone in those pages, not as a man, as an infection. Every investigator who touched that file left the job within months. One drove into a quarry and didn't leave a note. Another disappeared during a hiking trip. Their families refused interviews. Their homes, when checked, contained symbols scratched into door frames, the same ones from Boone's cave. Even in death, he was still recruiting. Some psychologists call it mimetic contagion, the spread of belief through exposure. Read the words. See the symbols, feel the rhythm of the ritual, and part of your brain starts to listen, starts to obey. The human mind was never built to stare that deep into madness without blinking. But here's where judgment truly failed. Because in 1994, a man named Jacob Ellery was arrested for the murder of 2 travelers in Virginia. He'd carved circles around the victims' remains, left jars of salt near their heads, and in his confession, he said, "I didn't kill them, I fed them. Boone told me to." The court declared him insane, but when they examined Ellery's possessions, they found something that shouldn't have existed. A photograph of the Boone cabin, taken in 1968. Elias standing in the doorway, and next to him, A boy, maybe 13, maybe younger, smiling. The image was authenticated. No sign of manipulation, no forgery, and that's when the idea of lineage resurfaced. If Boone had a child, or worse, a student, judgment had missed its mark by a generation. There's one final entry in the federal file, dated November 2003. The author's name is redacted, but the note reads, "Pattern persists. Ritual evolved. Subject likely deceased, but doctrine self-sustaining. Recommend indefinite containment of all materials." I read that line over and over. Doctrine, not crime, not cult. Doctrine, a word reserved for faith, not flesh. And that's when it hit me. The real judgment wasn't for Elias Boone. It was for us, for the people who looked away, who labeled it folklore, who allowed the hunger to root itself in silence. Boone didn't escape justice. We let him become justice, in his own twisted theology. You can burn bones, you can seal caves, you can close case files and stamp them solved. But you can't kill belief, not when it hides in fear, not when it sleeps in stories. Somewhere in those Appalachian hills, families still whisper his name, like a warning. Don't walk near the creek after dark. Don't answer if you hear your name called from the trees. Don't eat what you didn't kill. Old rules, passed down like scripture, each one a relic of the terror Boone left behind. And maybe that's what judgment really means. Not a gavel, not a verdict, but a scar that keeps reminding the living what they chose to forget. As for Boone himself, maybe he died in that cave, surrounded by the bones of his faith. Or maybe, like every myth that feeds on fear, he simply changed shape. Maybe judgment isn't supposed to end. Maybe it just waits for the next person to listen. Because sometimes the story doesn't stop when the killer dies. Sometimes it starts again when you speak his name. There are cases you close, and there are cases that close you. This one, it never stopped breathing. Even now, decades later, I still hear it. Faint, like static between radio stations. The whisper of a story that refuses to stay buried. The kind of story that doesn't just haunt the world, it inhabits it. I used to believe monsters were made of flesh. Now I know they're made of memory. And memory doesn't rot. It lingers, reshapes, infects. You can erase a name, burn a house, silence a town. But the past, it keeps talking. Sometimes through dreams, sometimes through people, sometimes through you. When I walked away from the Boone file, I thought I was done. I thought I'd exorcised the ghosts by speaking them aloud. But that's not how this works. You don't tell these stories to end them. You tell them so you remember what silence costs. Every photograph I reviewed, every interview I recorded, it all points to the same unanswerable truth. Evil doesn't begin when someone kills. It begins when someone justifies it. Boone called it devotion. His followers called it salvation. But what I saw in those rituals, what the world keeps forgetting, is that the human need to believe can twist anything into holiness, even hunger, even death. I've stared at his handwriting long enough to know it wasn't madness. It was faith. Distorted, obsessive, but faith all the same. And maybe that's what terrified me most. Because if faith can be corrupted so easily, then maybe goodness isn't as permanent as we want to believe. There's a quote I can't get out of my head. Something Dr. Winters wrote before she vanished. Monsters don't kill for pleasure. They kill to preserve meaning. She understood what we all ignored. Boone wasn't destroying life. He was collecting it, trying to hold something eternal inside a body that couldn't last. The same impulse that drives saints, drives sinners. The difference is what they're willing to sacrifice for it. Sometimes I wonder if the earth remembers what he did, The soil around Boone Hollow is still black, rich, alive, too alive. Locals won't plant there anymore. They say the crops grow fast, but the roots bleed red when pulled. I've never tested that rumor. Some things are better left unproven, and yet even after all this time, I can't help but feel drawn back to that cave. The rational part of me knows it's just stone and air. But when the wind moves through it, it hums, a deep, low vibration that seems to form words. If you stay long enough, your heart starts to match its rhythm. That's when you understand what Boone meant when he said, "The land remembers." Because it does. Everything we bury, it listens. Everything we hide, it grows roots. And when we pretend it's gone, that's when it starts feeding again. There's no happy ending here, no redemption, no neat confession to close the circle. The Boone case ends the same way every legend does, unfinished. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the story isn't supposed to give you closure. Maybe it's supposed to remind you that monsters are rarely born in darkness. They're born in light, when we stop watching. I sometimes ask myself if I became one of them. Not in act, but in obsession. I've spent so many years dissecting his mind that I've started to see the world through it. Every quiet town looks like a crime scene waiting to happen. Every believer looks like a warning. Every silence sounds like preparation. And I can't tell if that's paranoia or understanding. When people ask me why I still tell these stories, I give them the only answer that feels honest. Because forgetting is how evil survives. Not in shadows, in silence. It feeds on our nod for comfort, our urge to look away. Boone knew that. He knew that when memory fades, history resets, and monsters, they walk again. So when you turn off this recording tonight, when the room goes quiet and the lights dim, listen. If you hear a hum, faint and rhythmic, like a breath behind your walls, don't be afraid. It's just the land remembering. It's just history breathing. It's just the echo of what happens when love turns into devotion and devotion turns into hunger. Because in the end, every story like this, every scream that fades into dust, leaves behind the same question. What if the monster was never him? What if it was the faith that built him? That's the part they never put in the reports. And maybe that's why I keep talking, because someone has to remember before the silence does.